Hi everybody, welcome to my live cast. I'm Ezra. I am a cannabis consultant and you can find me at ezrahelps.com. What I do is help people understand cannabis, and I work with patients to help them better use cannabis. And today we're going to talk about whether cannabis is a drug, an herb, or a weed. And it may not seem like a very interesting question for a lot of people who are just smoking pot, and they don't really care whether it's a weed, an herb, or a drug. But it's a cool history for me because I detail this in my book, Cannabis Consulting, which comes out this summer. And that is all of the confusion around cannabis that has happened for centuries. So let me start with the plant. The plant is called Cannabis sativa. That's the scientific name for the plant. It's essentially one plant, whether we're talking about marijuana, cannabis, or hemp. There is something called Cannabis ruderalis. This is a northern growing cannabis plant that can be interbred with cannabis, but is not readily used in the whole cannabis field, except for something called auto-flowering, which is when it just creates flowers on its own without the change in the light cycle. So I won't get into ruderalis because we don't smoke it, and we don't use it for hemp fibers, and we also don't use it in medical cannabis. But cannabis originated in India, in China, in the Mongolian steppe. And it was a wild plant. It still grows there wild today. And essentially, we've been using it for over 10,000 years as a rope, as paper, as a food source, as a medicine, and as a spiritual plant, a plant that shamans use for spiritual healings. So it has an incredibly wide range of uses, and you have little pockets of people who treat it differently. You know, you have hemp growers who've been growing it for generations who have never smoked it, never occurred to them that you could use it as a medicine. And then you have people who are growing it for hash, for recreational uses, and then people who create it as medicine. So it's a very diverse plant. What separates all of these essentially is the cannabinoid content, right? This is the amount of these molecules in the plant that define its use. If it has almost no cannabinoid content, so very little THC, very little CBD, and other beneficial cannabinoids, then essentially it's hemp, no matter what size or shape it is. It is hemp, and hemp is used for paper, rope, fabric, and as an industrial building material. It's all kinds of uses. And hold on, looks like some people want to come. Happy to add you in. Thanks for joining, everybody. But what is fascinating, if we get to America, is the history of cannabis, hemp, and weed, and marijuana over the last 400 years. So in the 1600s, missionaries brought hemp over from Europe, and they settled in northern Mexico, which included Texas and New Mexico. And so they were growing hemp for basics, you know, paper and fiber. But it was growing as a weed too. It was growing out in the wild, and gets pollinated every summer, and the pollen flies on the wind, and seeds get dropped and picked up by the birds. And so a lot of people in Mexico were starting to realize that it had some psychoactivity when they used it. And so this is where you get the term marijuana. So marijuana doesn't refer to hemp or cannabis. It's just a slang term for the context you use it in, right? But in the 1800s, we had other immigrants coming to America who grew cannabis for its hash. So they were essentially growing the original marijuana in the US that was very potent, because to make hash, you need a lot of resin. And the resin comes from the flower tops and the leaves close to the flower tops. And so you had these parallel cultures in America surrounding cannabis. You had hemp growers who were missionaries. You had hemp growers who were George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. You had medicinal pharmacists, doctors were prescribing it in the late 1800s, and they would import their cannabis from India, because that's where the medicinal uses of cannabis were most influential on Europe and America, and they called it Indian hemp. So if you were a pharmacist in the late 1800s in the US, you would use Indian hemp to make your remedies. Well, Indian hemp was cannabis. It's the original cannabis, but it wasn't always potent, because if somebody says, oh, you want some hemp? I have hemp for you. And they'd give you 50 pounds of hemp, and it would have no psychoactivity. So in my book, I detail some of the stories of pharmacists who are just confused because they would make a bunch of remedies, give them to clients, and they wouldn't work. Well, meanwhile, there was another parallel culture that was the Middle Eastern immigrants in America, and they were growing this powerful hemp for the resin, and the pharmacists didn't know about it. So in 1913, the U.S. Agricultural Department finally announced that they could grow Indian hemp in America. They could grow medicinal cannabis, and they could stop getting it from India because they were always confused about what worked and what didn't. Meanwhile, they had no idea that these Turkish and Armenian and Middle Eastern immigrants had been growing it as hash for decades. So I love that hash was considered just a recreational drug for a lot of people. I'm sorry if anyone is trying to join on camera here. I'm adding you in and doing my best here, but it says some people can't add in. You're all welcome to watch the live cast, and I'm sorry if you can't see, but today have a lot of viewers, so thanks for joining in, everybody. So when you have all these things growing, there were no indoor grows, so people were growing weeds. It was just growing like weeds out in their in the land out west. People were growing hash cannabis also outdoors. The USDA, or the U.S. Agricultural Department, was growing medicinal cannabis outdoors. And then you had hemp farmers growing their hemp outdoors. And it was everywhere. So all of the crossbreeding was occurring. And you would have people who would not know, they didn't have a way to test the amount of THC in products. So there was a lot of confusion. Then in the mid or early 1900s, of course, we have a lot of the populist views that we have today, a lot of fear around immigrants. We didn't like the Chinese immigrants who had the opium dens, the Middle Eastern immigrants who had the hash dens, and we didn't like the Mexican immigrants who were smoking marijuana. So despite the fact that it was a very viable medication, we outlawed it. And so now here it is, 75, almost 100 years later, and people are, legalizing in states, but the problem is the confusion still exists. People still have such confusion around what's the difference between hemp, marijuana, cannabis, and now there's this extra element of a layer of confusion, and that is with CBD, cannabidiol. So CBD is a legal constituent of hemp and cannabis and marijuana that can be purchased anywhere and grown. It is grown all over the world because you can grow hemp that is high in CBD, or you can grow marijuana that's very low in THC and has high CBD. So the difference between herb, hemp, drug, evolves and changes over time. And it's really important to have knowledgeable people. This is what I do as a cannabis consultant, is try to unravel the confusion around this drug, around this herb, around this plant. I think it's especially funny that we now have regulations in over 30 states to legalize marijuana. And they're very strict. You know, they're basically regulating it the way they would regulate pharmaceuticals. You know, it has to be grown in secure locations. It has to be, you know, monitored by security cameras. They have to test every batch of cannabis. You know, they deliver it to these dispensaries that are locked down and with secure security agents, etc. But meanwhile, you have apothecaries. So an apothecary is like an herbal pharmacy, right? You can go to an apothecary. Nobody knows where that stuff's grown. They don't ask for an analysis of the herbs because they're not psychoactive. It's this notion of these herbs being so powerful that makes us want to fit cannabis into the pharmaceutical model that is very difficult to do because the plant is growing all over the place. Some plants, it is very high in THC, so it's psychoactive, and some plants are very low in THC, so they're just hemp. Now, context is everything, and it's important to have people like myself who can explain the difference. And now I'm working as an expert witness in court cases, because we now have court cases where somebody might be growing a CBD strain in their yard. They get arrested by the police because they think they're growing marijuana, but there's no THC in the plant at all. So it's really important that people understand it, that they know the difference between CBD plants, THC plants, what a hemp plant is, and what a marijuana plant. And ultimately, if we can slowly unravel it and educate everybody, then we can have an understanding of the difference between when we use it as an herb, when we use it as a drug, and I would say drug and herb in the case of high cannabinoid content cannabis is the same thing, and when it's a weed. And when it's a weed is how it grows in pretty much the rest of the world, and actually in the south of the US. You can drive alongside the road in Mississippi, in Louisiana, and see wild hemp growing that's probably still traceable to these missionaries who brought it over in the 1600s. So that's my live cast on cannabis and the differences in the various varieties of it. And if you want to get in touch with me, reach out to me on EzraHelps.com or send me an email, Ezra@EzraHelps.com, and let anyone know to join my Facebook group. I do a live cast every Tuesday at 11. Feel free to ask questions. I'll be over my website for a little bit. Thanks for joining.